Welcome to episode 1 of the Global Conservation Podcast. Today's episode will be entitled Securing a Future for China's Wild Plant Resources.
Alrighty, I just want to say welcome to everyone and thank you for tuning in. This is the first episode and hopefully a big mega hit. As I mentioned earlier, today's title is Securing the Future of China's Wild Plant Resources. Kind of an interesting topic here. Now, why would we be focusing on China's wild plant resources? Well, including Taiwan, China harbors nearly 33,000 vascular plant species, and it is a key source for global agricultural plants along with medicinal plants. And about half of these plants are endemic, meaning that these species are not found anywhere else on the entire planet. Now, 9,300 species are used in traditional Chinese medicine practices. So we're talking about such an intense diversity, and the question is whether or not and how we go about conserving this intense phytodiversity or plant diversity. And this will hopefully grow in importance, and China has showed steps of seeing this as something that needs addressing. But hopefully China can see the merits of preserving the biodiversity and in addition have a plan of implementation. And so we're actually discussing an article today, and the article was conducted by a group of researchers. We have Weiguo Sang, Keping Ma, and Axmacher. And they, in essence, have gone through, labeled key areas of conservation, and come up with a beautiful and simple 7-step implementation plan for seeing the preservation of China's intense phytodiversity. And I'd like to kind of go through with you all today what the implications are and what the good things and the bad things that we can take away from this. Now, before I dive into the specifics of this plan, I just wanted to kind of provide a short status quo of where China stands in regards to conservation. Now, China is the most populous nation on the planet, so you can imagine the amount of strain that is put on resource extraction for a country simply to feed its population. Now, China's agricultural system has changed drastically throughout the years, especially with Maoist programs and measures that have transformed the landscape and provided a lot of good things in terms of yields, but also bad things in terms of soil erosion, landslides, dust storms, and these things are affecting both urban and rural populations. And they have enacted quite a few reforestation projects, and the government has acknowledged that this is something worthy of paying attention. And they've banned logging and natural forest, and their definition of a natural forest is secondary growth forest, or it's been felled once, and it has less plant diversity, but still that's a pretty significant measure to an overall ban on logging. And the government is also banning collection of rare and endangered species. Now, this seems also like a hefty goal. The United States has the Endangered Species Act, which does something similar, but the difference here is that the Chinese government is simply not able to implement the enforcement to go along with it. And the United States has its own problems with enforcement. But so these are powerful measures that are in place, but there's simply a lapse of enforcement. Another factor we can point to is a rising middle class in China that is visiting these tourist areas and putting further strain on these reserves. And in general, the conservation programs that are in place tend to center around iconic species like the giant panda, and it's simply not comprehensive enough for what China really needs. And one token of the threat that currently exists in China is the invasive plant species impinging on the habitats of endemic and threatened plant species, and it ultimately costs the country $14.5 billion to deal with the ramifications of these invasive species, both plant and animal. And now we can begin the incredible process of going through this 7-part, incredibly comprehensive program that have been set forth by these researchers. Are you ready? Number 1, the need for a detailed survey of distribution and population sizes. This is simply a prerequisite to begin any sort of prioritization of species that need direct care.
Number 2.
The adjustment of the reserve network of the country. Now, China has made huge strides in setting aside national land in reserves. We're talking late 70s, having under 1% of the national land set aside in reserve network, to current day standards having a whopping 8%. That's a huge jump. Now, the problem being that these reserve networks are in areas that don't necessarily house the plant diversity that needs addressing. The Yunnan and the Sichuan provinces that are in the southern portion of the country, they house the majority of endemic plant species, and yet they house also the lowest percentages of land set aside in reserve network. Now, one fragment of this that the researchers point out is that there are 2,000 forest parks in the country that are currently framed for human enjoyment, and they point towards a need for perceptual change, that these parks could also be employed to house plant diversity, because that is something of national interest. Number 3. A general shift in priorities from short-term economic gain to long-term resource utilization. Now, this is not an easy goal at all. We're talking about the pursuit of sustainable ecotourism, something that still people are struggling with, and that you're talking about mainly rural provinces, people who are extracting resources largely out of need, and saying that that general shift needs to take place of acknowledging the importance of something as long-term investment as biodiversity conservation.
Number 4.
A steered urbanization of the rural population in China. Now, this would include the incentivizing of individuals that are inhabiting rural locations that are also ecologically sensitive areas to settle in more sustainable urban communities and ensure that the remaining population was educated in sustainable resource use. So it acknowledges the problem that there are these areas that are extracting resources and impinging on these threatened populations, but then providing a way for these populations of humans that would like to maybe live in urban areas, and incentivizing that movement while also educating the remaining population in ways that they can sustain themselves without impinging on these threatened species. Numbers 5, 6, and 7 collapse into a 30-second interval because we know you'd really rather just get the show on the road. No. We're talking about botanical garden establishment for rare species as sort of a database, a fallback plan, the preservation of the vitality of these individuals, and specifically in places that make sense for those species. Secondly, just kind of specific plans of implementation for target species and areas in the country of China. And third, China is a country investing both with funding and energy in the science of conservation, the personnel, all of the provisions that go along with that. So now we've gone through the plan. Now what exactly is it that we'd like to take away out of this comprehensive view set forth by the researchers? Running into some definite problems, one of them being funding. It can be difficult to convince a country, even with a growing economy and a large GDP like China, of the merits of preserving rare and endangered plant varieties. So we need to think of a varied argument. Here we can point to the cultural aspects, saying that medicinal practice in China could potentially go extinct along with the plant varieties that they depend on, so long as these unsustainable levels of foraging are continued. And unless conservation is taken seriously, that would be a tragic loss for the nation. And in terms of economics, we can point to the mitigation of invasive species costs that would go along with preserving native and rare species, in addition to rearrangement of the current reserve network that would be more fitting to the rare species, and that the country could also benefit from this. And we can point to other countries that are doing similar things. And so as a holistic approach, I guess my audience that I'm speaking to are the people that are getting on board a plane ride to Beijing and are thinking about visiting these parks and perhaps coming across in the forest a rare species of Actinidia colomicta, and thinking of the implications of that both for China as a nation and the globe, because these are biota that are never going to return. And so I leave you all with this token of wisdom and the termination of our first episode of the podcast.